I'm Ann Herring, and I'm very pleased to introduce our Grand Rounds presenter, Dr. Nicholas Brightboard. Dr. Brightboard is an assistant professor of psychiatry at the University of Arizona and the director of the Early Psychosis Intervention Center, the EPI-Center. The EPI-Center is a clinical research center dedicated to promoting recovery among individuals with first episode psychosis, supporting family members caring for those individuals, and developing improved treatments for psychotic disorders. The EPI-Center is the only specialized treatment program for first episode psychosis within Arizona. Dr. Brightboard has a PhD in clinical psychology from the University of California, Los Angeles, and completed his clinical internship and postdoctoral fellowship at Yale University. Dr. Brightboard has been awarded numerous prizes for his research, including the Charles Hughes Fellowship in Cultural Psychiatry from the Society for the Study of Psychiatry and Culture, and the Michael Goldstein Distinguished Research Award from the UCLA Clinical Psychology Program. His research has been funded by the National Institute for Mental Health, the Institute for Mental Health Research, the Arizona Center for the Biology of Complex Diseases, and the Foundation for Psychocultural Research. Dr. Brightboard served as an international consultant for the University of Calgary consensus process for identifying the critical elements of care for individuals with first episode psychosis. More recently, he served as an expert consultant for former Congressman Patrick Kennedy with regard to shaping healthcare reform to promote the prevention of mental, emotional, and behavioral disorders. Dr. Brightboard will be speaking to us today on the Early Psychosis Intervention Center, the 2-year experience. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Nicholas Brightboard.
Thank you all for coming today. I have a bad habit of walking away from the microphone. Of course, I won't recognize if I do because you'll hear it first. So if I do, hand signals letting me know. Always much appreciated. Many thanks to Dr. Herring. We were actually sitting here before Grand Rounds. It was kind of nice to reminisce about when I first came here to the University of Arizona. Actually, before that, when I was still out in Connecticut and got the phone call from Dr. Herring that we had gotten the necessary resources to open up Epicenter at what was then UPH Hospital and now is the University of Arizona Medical Center South Campus. So, quick talk about disclosures here. And so let's set the stage for the establishment of Epicenter. Back in January of 2010 when we opened the clinic, we were one of only a handful of such clinical research centers in the country that were specifically dedicated to early intervention for psychotic disorders. To give you a comparison of how far behind the U.S. is in this type of service delivery, at the same time, if we looked at the city of Toronto alone, you would have found about 11 different first episode psychosis clinics there, all run by different competing hospitals and universities in one city. It gives you an idea of where we need to grow in our services here. But we were one of the few, and unfortunately the ones that have opened up since then have still been sort of few and far between, although I think we now have more than one single city in Canada. But maybe actually going back to this, a first thing to notice is, it's not just about wanting to have one of these centers here. You really need a supportive environment with a fertile ground to open up a program like this. And with that in mind, I'd like to start off by thanking the many, many people who have helped out along the way to establish this program and keep it running. We can start here with our folks at U of A, both colleagues and trainees. Some of our colleagues are now gone, and my apologies. I'm sure I've forgotten people along the way here who should be on this list. But it's not just the U of A that gets a program up like this running. It's not a university that can sustain any one of these programs. What was really nice here was the wonderful community collaborators that I've had the opportunity to work with, who have been nice enough to let me harass them about participating in grant applications and referring people our way, who have been nice enough to help spread the word about Epicenter, who have really made the successes that I'm going to be talking about here all the more possible. So, with that in mind, let's switch to a slightly more depressing topic, which is the normal course of psychotic disorders. If we look at what the prototypical psychotic disorder, schizophrenia, looks like over a 20-year period, the outcomes under usual care are pretty dismal. This was from the Madras longitudinal study of individuals with the first episode of psychosis. And they followed these folks for 20 years, and what they found was that, as they show on the top line there, there's about a lucky 8% of folks here who have one episode of psychosis and under usual care will not experience any more relapses or hospitalizations. The remaining 90+% are really in line for a much worse course of illness, ranging from in line 2 people with repeated relapses with periods of recovery in between, line 3 people with repeated relapses with partial recovery in between, and an unfortunate 8% that have persistent psychotic symptoms no matter what is offered to them. These relative percentages here have now been replicated across a couple studies here, and they all tend to show the typical results of about 90 to 95% of folks here end up in categories 2, 3, and 4. That's not a very optimistic scenario to present to people when they first show up with the first episode of psychosis. But it's not just the individuals with psychotic disorders that suffer. These are really illnesses that affect the entire family. This was a study that we did back in Los Angeles, starting back in 2008, where we followed a cohort of Mexican Americans who were caring for a relative with schizophrenia. And we tracked their perceptions of their physical, mental, and general health using a measure called the RAND36, or some of you might be more familiar with it as the SF36. Essentially what it does is it ranks your health on a scale of 0, which is essentially death, to 100, which would be the best possible health. And if you get a score of 50, that means that you have the average health of the typical American your age right there. So 50 is average on this scale here. What we found that was very shocking was the decrements in physical and mental health that caregivers experience for caregivers of relatives with schizophrenia. On physical health, that PHC line there, they were well below the 50th percentile, well below average compared to their same age peers in the U.S. And they even had worse physical health than their relatives with schizophrenia. And this was pretty unexpected, at least from our point of view, because schizophrenia and psychotic disorders in general tend to bring along with them a number of risk factors for poor health outcomes. Substance abuse, sedentary behavior, things that don't necessarily bode well. But the caregivers themselves were experiencing decrements in physical health that exceeded that of their relatives with schizophrenia, even though they didn't necessarily bring with them these risk factors for poor physical health. Also interesting was the mental health component among the key relatives. And on this measure, mental health is really looking at anxiety and depression. And the mental health of the caregivers in terms of anxiety and depression was well below the norm for their same age peers in the U.S., but also was equivalent to that of their relatives with schizophrenia. And this was pretty striking to us. It is just as anxiety-provoking and depression-provoking to have probably one of the worst mental illnesses that you can imagine as it is to care for someone, have a loved one with that illness there. So these illnesses and their deleterious effects spread outside of the individual. And they go through the family and they go to society at large. Probably the best way to look at the societal cost is to look at the actual financial cost of these illnesses. So for looking at one specific psychotic disorder, schizophrenia in 2002, cost of care was about $63 billion. 2012 dollars, that looks more like $85 billion. We're treating a disorder that affects about 1 to 2% of the population, and we're spending $85 billion a year to treat it here. This is an expensive disorder that comes with huge cost. Interestingly, if we look at where these costs are coming from here, the direct health care that we provide is only about a third of that. In 2002, it was $22.7 billion. The biggest cost of these illnesses are what these authors refer to as indirect costs. And here we're looking at lost wages due to not working or being unable to due to the symptoms of the illness, lost wages that caregivers face for taking off time to care for their ill relative, money spent by families to help support their ill relative. I often look at this slide as sort of a good sobering reminder of who is really carrying the cost of these illnesses and carrying the cost of care. It's unfortunately not us in the healthcare profession, it's the families themselves who are providing the majority of the care for these individuals. So to continue along this depressive line of thinking here, this is, I love this study. This is a paper by Hegarty and colleagues in 1994 in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And the paper is called 100 Years of Treatment of Schizophrenia. And they looked at across decades here how many people with schizophrenia were experiencing positive outcomes in the reported published literature here. And the very depressing information that they found is it hasn't really changed over time. Back in the early 20th century, when we were still treating people with water treatment and submerging them in icy cold water and to treat them for schizophrenia, we were seeing similar percentage of people improve as we are these days when we have many antipsychotics available in our tool belt. We have a variety of evidence-based psychosocial treatments here. The number of people who've improved in these illnesses, even though the treatments have supposedly improved, hasn't really changed. So why is this? Is this indicative that we really need to find better treatments? Well, I suppose so. But a more easily implemented idea is that it's not the treatments that need to improve, but when we provide them to people. It will take a long time to develop the magic drug for schizophrenia, but we can provide treatments earlier in the course of these illnesses right now. And this is not a new idea. Harry Stack Sullivan, back in 1927, noted that too many psychiatrists, and really we should say mental health professionals here, deal with individuals with psychotic disorders only after they've progressed far into the course of illness. And he speculated way back then, or I guess I shouldn't say speculated, because he said, I feel certain, that if we can start the treatment earlier with these individuals here, we might be able to prevent a lot of the decline in functioning and deleterious health effects that tend to accompany these disorders here. We don't need new treatments, we need earlier treatments. Well, the subsequent research since then has really supported this idea of there being a critical period for intervening in psychotic disorders, and that critical period is within the first few years of illness. Well, why do we think that's a critical period? First of all, to back up a little bit here, most people with a psychotic illness go for several years before they ever receive treatment after the illness emerges here. In the research literature, we talk about this as being the duration of untreated psychosis, the time between when the symptoms first start and the time between when you receive treatment here. Worldwide, that average duration of untreated psychosis is 2 years. So by the time we see someone with schizophrenia, odds are they've gone 2 years with full frank psychotic symptoms before getting any treatment. This is incredibly problematic because these early years are when our interventions work best and when most of the decline in functioning is occurring in these illnesses here. We know that the 5-year period after the start of illness is when people are experiencing the greatest decline in functioning. This is when they're losing jobs, when they're losing friends, when their relationships with caregivers are beginning to get strained here, where they're losing independent living status here. Also, and not surprisingly, that how severe your symptoms are in these first few years of illness is directly proportional to how bad they're going to be 20 years down the road. The worse your symptoms are in the first few years of illness, the worse they're going to be down the road, suggesting that if we can maybe dampen or restrict how bad these symptoms get in the early years, we may potentially have long-term effects on the course of these illnesses here. And not surprisingly, if we're thinking about issues of cost of care and ease of care, if we can get people into treatment earlier, if we can reduce this duration of untreated psychosis, they come to us in less distress. It's not surprising. They're less suicidal. Their symptoms of psychosis and depression and anxiety are less severe. And when symptoms are less severe, well, they're also easier to treat. It makes everything work much better if we can get people into treatment early. And so it was with this rationale that we opened up Epicenter here, which is still Arizona's only specialized clinical service for first episode psychosis. And I remember when someone telling me, wow, that's great that you guys are the only game in town. And my response was, no, that's unfortunate that we're the only game in town. These are, ideally, these would be, there wouldn't be one of these in a single state. But what we do is we provide really a trans-diagnostic psychosocial intervention, a group of interventions that are tailored not for people with any one specific disorder specifically, but for individuals who have psychosis as part of a mental health condition here. So we treat individuals with schizophrenia, schizoaffective, bipolar disorder with psychotic features, major depression with psychotic features. As long as there's psychosis there and it's not due to a general medical condition, we treat them. And we package a set of psychosocial interventions that were developed, we combined specifically for Epicenter because these were services that we know work for individuals with psychosis but weren't available in the community. These include cognitive behavioral therapy, family psychoed, and cognitive remediation. I'm going to take a little bit to talk about some of the evidence behind these treatments here. So I imagine many of you are familiar with this book. It was kind of the book that got the cognitive revolution going in mental health care. Came out in 1979. I imagine some of you might even own this book. Well, about 27 years before this, Aaron Beck was writing about cognitive therapy for individuals with schizophrenia. And if you really want to track the history of cognitive therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy, it starts with schizophrenia in this first seminal paper that came out in Psychiatry in 1952 here. A case study of successfully treating an individual, helping them reduce their delusional conviction using what we would now look at now as standard cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. So, unfortunately, the use of cognitive behavioral therapy as standard care for psychosis is really only more recent, starting really on a large scale in the late 1990s and continuing today. But there have been 34 randomized controlled trials, at least, that were completed by 2008, and they very clearly show that cognitive behavioral therapy for psychosis reduces positive symptoms here. This is very important because it does this in people who are taking medication here. So it cleans up the residual psychotic symptoms that remain when someone is already on an antipsychotic medication here. And interestingly, a specific advantage of these psychosocial treatments over the pharmacological treatments is that the benefits of these interventions persist even after the intervention ends. You don't forget the cognitive therapy techniques you learn in therapy the day after your therapy ends. But when that medication leaves your body, it leaves your body. So follow-up data, now up to 12 months after treatment, suggests that these treatment gains continue, that even when you're not actively participating in the cognitive behavioral therapy, you're still able to use it successfully, and you're using it successfully to keep your symptoms at bay. So what are we talking about here when we're talking about CBT for psychosis? Well, it's pretty much our standard CBT techniques that we use for anxiety and depression and everything else that CBT is part of standard care for here. We're learning strategies to cope with adversity here. Adversity is a normal experience. This is very key to emphasize to your individuals with psychosis here. We don't want to pathologize people. We want to highlight that dealing with adversity is a fundamentally human process. If you have psychosis, you might just have some unique adversities that you need to work on here. But the idea of dealing with adversity is normal, so we can use our normal tool bag to deal with this here. We can role play. We can do simulations. We can do cognitive restructuring. And essentially, we can give you strategies to help manage these anxieties here. Family psychoed, on the other hand, brings in the family members, and we use a multifamily group psychoeducation model here where we do a group with multiple families all together here. And our goal is really to shore up that familial resource there to make sure that everyone in the family is in the best place possible to help out the individual with psychosis. They're the ones who are paying the largest cost here. Well, they're the ones who probably deserve the best tools. So we provide them with more education than they probably ever wanted to know about psychosis. We provide them with emotional support. We go over very concrete strategies to cope with and deal with symptoms here. And then we, on a bi-weekly basis, go over strategies to improve communication in the family and build up problem-solving skills. So that as adversity emerges, we have a family that is well-equipped to deal with it here. Not surprisingly, family psychoeducation is probably the longest and most well-studied intervention, psychosocial intervention in the psychotic disorders literature. And when we look over about the 1,500 people who have completed and randomized trials of this, it's very clear that participating in family psychoeducation reduces the likelihood that individuals with psychotic disorders are going to have a relapse of psychotic symptoms over the next year or so, and it reduces the likelihood that they're going to end up in the hospital over the next year or so. Interestingly, it also seems to be helpful with the pharmacological treatments in that people who participate in family psychoed also are more likely to adhere to the medication that they're prescribed here. So it's a very nice complement in the complex and often multimodal treatment that is required for individuals with psychotic disorders. And finally, cognitive remediation is kind of a new player to the game in terms of psychosocial treatments here. But essentially, it involves a series of exercises designed to address the cognitive deficits that accompany psychotic disorders. Deficits in memory, problem solving, attention. These deficits are present before the illness emerges. By the time someone's at their first episode, they're about 1 standard deviation below the mean on pretty much every cognitive measure you can give them. And if left untreated, they're going to progress to about 1.5 to 2 standard deviations below the mean. Cognitive remediation can rebuild these skills in individuals, and not surprisingly, if we look at the data, it very clearly improves cognitive functioning in individuals. It is also associated with reduction in symptoms, with the current hypothesis being that by improving cognitive skills, we help people in their ability to manage stressful and challenging daily life activities, and by reducing their stress, we may then be reducing their symptoms here. It also is associated with better social functioning here, which makes sense. If you can remember what someone actually says to you in a conversation, well, you're probably going to be able to participate more actively and more adequately in that social interaction. So with all that in mind, we have 3 goals here with Epicenter. We want to promote recovery among individuals with first episode psychosis. We want to support the family members who are carrying the lion's share of the care for these individuals with first episode psychosis. And with all this going on, we also want to work to develop improved care for these individuals here. Hopefully, the next time Hegarty and colleagues does an update on the care for schizophrenia by decade, we'll see a big increase at the end of it there by some of the improved treatments that people are working on currently. So who are the folks that we're working with here? We're really working with people in the early course of the illness here, right after the frank onset of psychotic symptoms in the first few years here. First episode psychosis is unfortunately a bit of a misnomer, because if you look at how it's defined in the research literature, what we're really talking about is people within the first few years of the illness. At Epicenter, we treat people within the first 5 years after the frank onset of psychotic symptoms. So looking at the people we're treating here today, I actually had to update this just today because we enrolled someone this morning, but that was actually kind of nice to be able to do. But currently we have 37 individuals with recent onset psychosis who are participating in the clinic and 41 caregiving relatives here. We have a good sort of payer mix here with about half of the folks coming in with private insurance, about 40% coming in from CPSA, either with Title 19 or not Title 19, but still treated by one of the CPSA sites, and 11% who are uninsured and not affiliated with any of the CPSA sites when they come in here. If we look at how we compare racially and demographically to Tucson, we're a pretty good representation of Tucson here, except with regard to Hispanic Latino ethnicity here. We're still struggling to get people in the clinic. You would assume that this should be proportional to the population here, based on the epidemiological evidence of the incidence of schizophrenia not really varying by ethnicity. Well, why are we not getting these people here? I think that highlights some of our future goals for what we want to do with Epicenter in terms of outreach. So we talked about what we do intervention-wise. We talked about who we serve. Let's talk about some of the outcomes we've been able to achieve to date here. Hospitalization is always something that people are interested in. It's typically an outcome that patients want to avoid. It's the most costly psychiatric treatment outcome that we could look at there. So it becomes something that people get interested in. So what we did was we compared our hospitalization rate, one-year hospitalization rate, to not the normal course of schizophrenia, because that would be kind of that's sort of an easy battle to win right there. But let's compare us to the other seminal first episode psychosis programs around the world. And as you can see, we're at the far left end of that distribution there with the lowest hospitalization rate compared to at least the other available published rates from first episode psychosis programs in the US, in Canada, Europe, and Australia. Remission of psychotic symptoms in first episode psychosis is the norm. Available data suggests that about 80 to 90% of people should experience a full remission of psychotic symptoms within the first year of treatment if you start treating early in illness there. So to say that we help people remit their symptoms again wouldn't really be showing much because, well, most people will under usual care. But maybe a different battle to say here is how quickly do we get people to remission? So at Epicenter, the median time to remission of psychotic symptoms is 3 weeks. And to give you an idea of how fast that is, we can compare that to the median time of remission for pharmacotherapy only for first episode psychosis. These are the only 4 studies published to date that have published time to remission data looking at antipsychotic medication among individuals with first episode psychosis. And as you can see, 3 weeks is again at the low end of that distribution there. Now that's probably nothing unique to what we do at Epicenter, but just really reflects the idea that intervening early and intervening intensely with a combination of meds and psychosocial treatments can really change the normal course of illness that we think of with psychotic disorders. So, like I was talking about with cognitive behavioral therapy, part of what we want to do is help people feel more confident in their ability to manage their psychotic symptoms. To look at this, we use a measure of self-efficacy, which is your perceived ability to manage a given task. And we looked at individuals' perceived self-efficacy with their ability to control their positive symptoms, their negative symptoms, and engage in satisfying and meaningful social skills there. And from baseline to 6 months, we see people getting more confident in their ability to manage their positive symptoms. We see a trend for their ability to manage their negative symptoms and also a trend to engage in better social skills here. So people are getting what we'd hope we'd getting here. They're getting the tools and feeling more confident in using them to manage the symptoms of these illnesses here. But it's not just psychosis. Psychosis, I should say, is not the only symptom that accompanies psychotic disorders. We're realizing more and more that anxiety and depression are also common follow-alongs with psychotic processes here. So from baseline to 6 months, we see a reduction in anxiety among our folks here in the clinic here. Depression, we see the same. So very quickly, we're taking down 2 of the most likely and oftentimes most frustrating and rate-limiting symptoms in terms of getting back to work and having a satisfying life. Substance abuse, as I'm sure all of you know, is a huge problem in psychotic disorders here. Within 6 months, our substance rate scores go down. People essentially, to sort of give some meaning to what 0 to 5 means here, we're taking people who come in typically already abusing some substance here, and within 6 months they're still using, but they no longer meet criteria for abuse. If you take out tobacco from this, which is our most commonly used drug of abuse, that 6-month score drops down to right about here. So it highlights 2 things, the importance of really working for smoking cessation in psychotic disorders and how that often becomes the drug of choice for these individuals here. Number of friends. I think that this is my favorite measure of social functioning that you can use here, because number of friends is such a complex social process here. You have to be able to maintain conversations. You have to be able to meet people. You have to be able to manage any social anxiety you bring into a situation right here. So within 6 months, when our people walk in the door, compared to 6 months later, they have about twice as many close friends. And we use a very strict definition of what a friend is here. Can't be a Facebook friend. Can't be someone you've never met. This has to be someone that you see, that you talk to at least once a week, that you can share personal details with here. And even with that, we see an increase in the number of friends that our folks are reporting here. This is, if we looked at the normal course of illness, we would be seeing a progressive decline in number of friends here. So not only are we improving it, but we've changed the direction of this relationship. Quality of life. From baseline to 6 months, we're seeing an improvement in physical health and a trend with regard to improvement of social relationships and the quality of the environment that one lives in. But maybe a better way to look at this is to think about what the norms on this measure are. This is the WHO quality of life instrument here, and a score of 50 translates roughly to average quality of life for someone living in the world right here. These are individuals with psychotic disorders, and within 6 months, we get everyone up to the average quality of life on all 4 domains or better here. That's pretty, I was very happy to see that, because you don't typically think of good quality of life as going hand in hand with psychotic disorders here. But within 6 months, we can get these people up to the same quality of life as the average individual living out there in the world. Vocational and educational functioning. So baseline, 50% work. 6 months, 50% work. How do we interpret this right here? It's hard to make any conclusions there. But one way we can look at this is looking at benchmark data with regard to the typical course of vocational and educational functioning. Kalaki and colleagues reviewed this in 2008, and using the conservative end of how many people would still be working at this point, they suggest about 25% would. Well, our number of 50% exceeds that, suggesting that we're helping people avoid the normal deleterious course of vocational and educational functioning that tends to accompany psychotic disorders here. Another way we can compare this is to compare our data to outcome data for the best vocational treatment that's out there for psychotic disorders, IPS and supported employment, done by Bob Drake and colleagues at Dartmouth. And they find that they can get, with this intensive treatment program that actually provides you with a job, 50% of people are able to work at the end of that, even if they're given jobs. With our data, where we're not providing people jobs, they're left on their own to find their own, we're getting similar results to that, suggesting that we're preventing the loss and we're keeping people at an ideal, comparatively ideal level of vocational and educational functioning. One of the things that we just put out a paper on is looking at the idea of self-determination among individuals with first episode psychosis. And we drew on Ryan and DC's concept of self-determination theory, which really suggests that there are 3 basic needs that we have out there in the world. We have a need for autonomy, feeling like we're able to do things in the world; competence, feeling like we're effective in what we want to do in our world; and relatedness, feeling like we have meaningful social relationships with others right here. And if you compare individuals with first episode psychosis to individuals who don't, not surprisingly, individuals with first episode psychosis report a worse sense of autonomy, a worse sense of competence, and a worse sense of relatedness. Interestingly, if you look at these 3 and you see which one's going to predict outcome among individuals with first episode psychosis, the only one that really seems to matter is relatedness. Having a sense that you have connections with others is associated with better quality of health, better symptoms, and better social functioning. That was kind of surprising, because we expected autonomy to really carry the day here. That's one that gets talked about a lot here in the research literature as being very important. But our data really suggested that relatedness, feeling like there are other people out there that care about you, that you understand you, might be equally, if not more important. Well, if we look at our epicenter folks from baseline to 6 months, what we see are improvements across the board on these 3 indices of self-determination, with what we'd consider statistically significant improvements in competence and, maybe more importantly, relatedness. After 6 months of treatment, people are feeling like their need for relatedness is getting better met out there in the world. And, well, this might be important because that seems to be the specific need for individuals with first episode psychosis that's associated with all the outcomes we'd hope would happen. Better social functioning, less symptoms, better quality of life. And thinking back to the idea of cost savings here, epicenter very clearly is not just a cost-effective treatment, but a cost savings treatment here. It's you can look at cost savings in a number of different ways here. So I presented the data 2 different ways. One is including the cost that it takes to provide the services. And why I included that in one and not the other is because we take people with private insurance, we do recoup some of that. So the top number here includes service delivery costs, and we might think of this as sort of an absolute cost effectiveness. We save on an annual basis about $700 on the cost of care. So we can provide more care for people, load them up with 3 evidence-based psychosocial treatments that they typically don't get, and their cost of care goes down by doing that. It's about a 4% reduction in what we think the annual cost of care would be for someone with a psychotic disorder. Now, if we don't include the service delivery cost, if we think about this more from a perspective of a clinic who is interested in setting up a program like this, who would be recouping money and was interested in knowing, well, will we save money? Well, once you start including the money that you can bring in from billing insurance, now we're looking at about a little over $2,300 per patient that we save annually, a 12% reduction in cost of care here. Again, there's very little I think you can say to argue against providing more care if it's going to save money and also produce better outcomes. But it's not just the individuals with psychosis we work with, it's also their caregivers, and we do a lot to track their outcomes as well too. Interested, of course, seeing if we can prevent some of those declines in physical and mental health that tend to accompany these illnesses. Anxiety among caregiving relatives is a huge problem. You can imagine if you had any relative with a chronic illness, you would feel pretty anxious and worried about them. Well, within 6 months, we can knock that down here among the caregiving relatives here. Depression. Well, we didn't knock it down in depression here, but some, I'm biased, of course, but so we can talk a little bit about maybe another way to look at the data here. So this is using the Beck Depression Inventory here. To get a score of even mild depression on the Beck Depression Inventory, you have to get a score of 10 or above. When people walk in our door, they're at about an 8, and they go down to about a 6. There's really not much room to go down when you're in the not even mild depressed range right there. What I think this shows is maybe not something specific to what we do at Epicenter, but again, the idea that early intervention has huge benefits, not just for the individuals with the illness, but for their caregivers as well, too. If you start treatment early, you can prevent a lot of the hardships that the families are experiencing here, and maybe we can even prevent some of the depression that they experience as a result. Caregiver burden, which is a term that I don't like very much, but it's how it's described in the literature. It seems to always imply to me that the relative is a burden in some way here. But what we're really looking at here is the amount of activities that the caregivers are engaging in to care for their relative, objective burden, and subjective burden being the worry and angst that tends to accompany having a relative with a chronic illness. And we see within 6 months a trend on both of these for burden levels to go down among our caregivers. And quality of life. As I noted before on that first slide, when we looked at the Mexican-American cohort, we showed that their physical health was not only below the norms for their same age peers in the U.S., but was also worse than their relative with schizophrenia. Well, if we look at the physical health here among these folks right here, it is almost off the chart, and we even get it higher after 6 months of participation in Epicenter here. Again, all of these values here are right above that 50 value here, which is the average, which is pretty surprising. Again, you don't typically think of an individual caring for a relative with schizophrenia as having quality of life that well exceeds the norm for the average person walking out there in the world here. Again, early intervention. We get them in early before the distress happens. We can get them in before that decrease in quality of life occurs. And well, even participating in our services, we can boost it up even a little above that as well too. Enacted support. This is how much support caregivers give to their ill relatives. This goes down. Any idea if that's a good thing or a bad thing? Good? Why?
Because they're really much more themselves.
Yeah, exactly. And that was, this is very exciting to see, and this is what I was hoping to see here. It's not that the caregivers are not caring for their relative anymore. It's that they don't need to do as much for their individual relative at this point here. These people are better able to take care of things on their own. They can better manage their symptoms. They can live independently. These are the goals in the end that we're really striving for here with treating these illnesses. So one of the nice things about Epicenter being located at U of A is we've been able to incorporate trainees, psychology interns, and psychiatry residents into the service delivery model we have here. In my more devious mind, what we're doing here is we're really creating a cadre of individuals in the mental health field who have the skills to be able to provide these specialized services to individuals with psychotic disorders here. Hopefully that will then expand access to them here in the community. But enough about my devious plan here. How well is it working? It works pretty well. So the training program that we've been doing, we track on our trainees how well they feel their knowledge is with regard to our three interventions: cognitive behavioral therapy, family psychoed, and cognitive remediation, and how much confidence they have in their ability to deliver these interventions here. And not surprisingly, between pre-training and post-training, all of these go up. Everyone walks out of our training feeling more confident and more knowledgeable with regard to delivering these interventions to individuals with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders here. One data point that I didn't put on here, but I really should have, was we also asked them, how effective do you think psychosocial treatments are for individuals with psychotic disorders? And from pre-training to post-training, that number also increases, suggesting that my devious plan may be coming to fruition here, that we're creating these individuals who feel they have the tools to provide evidence-based psychosocial care to individuals with psychotic disorders, but also see the utility of doing so at the same time. So, where do we go from here? One of the things that always is probably at the top of my list of things I want to improve is the number of people who actually decide to enroll in Epicenter. So this is our referral data to date. Over 2 years, we've had 167 referrals, of which only 37 have decided to participate in the program here. A number of them didn't meet criteria. 9 of them didn't have psychosis. So those are actually the best meetings to have with people, by the way. But 95 individuals who at first glance appeared eligible for our service decided not to participate here. About 3 times as much who actually did. And that's very concerning here. We spend a lot of time doing outreach efforts with folks here. We do a lot to make sure that the engagement process is as flexible as possible. But you can't help but look at this data here and wonder, what are we not doing to meet the needs of individuals with first episode psychosis? So why is our treatment not appealing to them? And that, I think, is going to be a key direction as we move forward here to hopefully change that ratio of enrolled to refused here to a more promising one. But if you think enrolled to refused is pretty distressing, how about never referred? So if we look at epidemiological data for how many people we would expect to have had a first episode of psychosis in Tucson over these last 2 years, well, it kind of dwarfs those other numbers here. We're looking at 1,600 plus individuals who are in the greater Tucson community who should be eligible for our service, who we've never heard a single thing about here. That is where the real distressing information is coming from here. Not all of them may want to participate in what we offer. Not all of them may need to participate in what we offer. But there is likely a decent chunk, even 10% of that 1,600, if we could get that. That's a huge amount of people that we're missing out on in the services we're offering. The other thing that always makes me a little sad is thinking about the vocational data here, because it doesn't go up. And in the end, knowing that you only have a 50% chance of competitive employment or being involved in education, I think is a pretty disappointing outcome, especially if we look at the benchmark that I think we really should be looking at, not the expected data, not associated with the best treatment that's out there, but the employment rate in the local community here. And this is the bar that I hope we can get closer to here, that we can get above that 50th percentile here, and we can help our folks achieve the vocational and educational functioning that for them is often at the very top of their list of things that they want from treatment and for their life. So one last future direction here. I love Calvin and Hobbes, so this I thought was a nice transition to maybe highlight some of Calvin's grandiosity to drain the lake as a preface to what I'm going to talk about, which I think reflects my own maybe grandiose thinking here. So if we look at the leaders in the world for providing early intervention services, what we're seeing is movement to a model of national systems of care where we have catchment areas, each one situated with an early intervention center there, so that anyone can easily access these services here that so clearly help people and so clearly save money. This is the UK system right here that they've set up here with about 50 different early intervention centers divided across these different catchment areas here. So in my grandiose thinking, I wonder about Arizona, where we do have our own sort of catchment style here with the REBAs here, and wondering if someday we could move to a model where early intervention services become a component of the care that's provided in each one of these areas here. A component that then could be easily accessed as needed and is really seen not as a rare service that's out there, but part of routine care for individuals with psychotic disorders. And then finally, if that wasn't grandiose enough for you, we can return to this slide, which is what our clientele is here. In the end, our clientele is a small sliver of folks with psychotic disorders here. If we really want to be an epicenter for care, we need to expand who we're caring for here. And we need to be able to provide care for people who are showing the early warning signs of the illness in that prodromal phase, and also the people who we are unfortunate to miss who now have long-standing illnesses. The research suggests that the interventions we provide to individuals with first episode psychosis is very clearly effective both for people on both ends of that illness spectrum there. So if we have the tools, maybe we can expand who we can offer them to here. We're beginning to do this a little bit with people on the early end of the illness, where we have one trial up right now, offering them treatment. We've started a more sort of, not treatment study, but study on individuals with long-standing illnesses that we're hoping is then going to set the groundwork and foundation for expanding care in that direction right there. And we can offer these services to folks, ideally through the community providers that are here in town already, so that everyone with a psychotic disorder who wants to benefit from these interventions has the opportunity to do so, or at least has the opportunity to tell us to get lost, that they don't want it. But you deserve that opportunity. So with that, I'd like to thank you all for coming out here. It's really an honor to talk to you all. Many of the people on my thank you list are here watching, so it's been really fun getting to show some of this data here with you in person here. Thanks. Yes.
First of all, that was very, very interesting, and I really enjoyed it. I got to wondering about your team. I assume there must be a team of people with different professional skills that deal with the patient. Can you say a bit about the composition of the team and how do they make sure they're working together?
Okay, so it's a small team. So the family psychoeducation intervention, that group is led by myself and 1 to 2 psychology interns who rotate through the program over the course of a year. The cognitive behavioral therapy group that we do is led by 2 psychiatry residents from the South Campus branch of the medical center, and they do that as part of their 3rd year training. The cognitive remediation is provided by 2 different research assistants that we have there, BA level mental health providers, and all of it is sort of coordinated through me, through individual supervisions, group supervisions, sort of always following up with patients. Part of the way we keep it coordinated is that I am the central point of contact for every individual participating in Epicenter. So they have a question about anything, I'm the person that they call. And that way it allows to sort of keep a very meta view of everything that they're experiencing throughout the program here, and with that in mind, be able to tailor the intervention as needed to their needs.
Thank you.
Yeah, Clark.
In terms of moving toward the more pre-morbid stage, how do you get people who are not sick to want help?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And so even if we look at this prodrome phase right here, people in that early stage of the illness before the onset of frank psychotic symptoms are typically already in distress, not due to the psychotic symptoms they're experiencing, but maybe due to anxiety, to depression, to declining performance in school, to growing conflict in family. So wherever there's distress, there's often motivation for alleviating that distress, and that's often what we tap into right there. it's also part of the rationale for that early intervention, that why should we let people sit there and suffer until they develop psychosis before we offer any treatment to them? Yeah.
My understanding correctly that we now can refer people less than 18 years old to epicenter?
No, I wish. And that's not my choice, but it's due to the license that we have at the South Campus. And I promise you, the day that license changes, I will be calling people up and begging for referrals. But what we've done to date with people who are younger than 18 is since I do have an opportunity to see some patients here at the university campus, which is licensed to see people under 18, I see them individually until they turn 18. And we can essentially do all our interventions on an individual basis as opposed to a group basis. And when they turn 18, they come down to epicenter. Yeah, Ari?
I think you're doing a really great job for the community, thank you. I have one or two questions. I'm kind of stuck with the slide you showed early on. Mm-hmm. One was by Harry Stack Sullivan. Mm-hmm. I was wondering, as I remember, he died in 49. So what he meant at that time, about early what do you know what he was talking about? At that time, there were not many medications. Mostly treatment was kind of supportive and.
Yeah, so you're talking about what type of treatment was he talking about that he could wish he could provide?
What you can do early on.
Well, it's hard to speculate what he was thinking about, but it probably would have been more of a psychosocial treatment early on in the illness. And again, to maybe highlight how he had some good forethought there, or he had good predictive powers for what the research was going to show for the next coming years, is that psychosocial interventions provided earlier in the course of the illness have a better effect than later on right there. And in fact, if we get people in that prodromal phase right there, the psychosocial treatments seem to work much better than any pharmacological treatment here. So what he was working with at that time with the idea of psychosocial treatments and thinking that they should be done earlier in the course of illness actually sort of maps on with what we know about how these illnesses progress and how to treat them effectively. But you said there was a second question?
Yeah, the other question was about this slide about treatment for psychotic disorders. Mm-hmm. Like you mentioned, there has not been much change. But if you look at in 60s, 70s, 80s, there was, a better outcome. Mm-hmm. Then I don't know what's happening after 90s.
Oh, yeah.
So what's the explanation? What happened there? Was it because of chemotherapy or something, or was there something else going on?
I don't have a good answer to that one, and I don't think that I don't remember Hegarty and colleagues offering one for that little hump in the center right there, other than to say that if you compare the percentages across the decades, they didn't really differ from each other that much. So that hump, we would speculate, might just be due to chance and some random variation that we would expect across the decades. Foster.
With your slide where you said that 95 people turned down the plan of service, why do you think they turned you down?
Oh, well, lots of reasons. And it depends on the person here, but common ones would be, most of our referrals still come from the inpatient unit here. And the last experience that any of our folks want to have is going into the inpatient unit here. They often come out of it, I would say traumatized is the legitimate word to use here. Maybe not often, that's not to criticize the care that's provided in the inpatient service, but just the idea of forcible, involuntary hospitalization by definition is going to be traumatic for folks. And it's often prefaced by, maybe the police showing up at your house and handcuffing you and the embarrassment that incurs right here. And then they meet me and I say, hey, when you leave here, you want to come down to the first floor as opposed to the second floor and work with me. And the last place they ever want to see again is that building. So that's often a key reason there. We have, people talk a lot about lack of insight. And I have seen people come in with, a lack of insight into their illness as being a reason why they don't want to pursue care. But that's often a rare reason why. It's usually traumatic. Actually, now that I think about it, probably the most common one is traumatic entry into the mental health system. And because of that, not wanting to continue with it is probably our biggest barrier here. Second biggest barrier is they work or they're in school and they don't want to come see me, 3 to 5 hours a week because they have a life. And in many ways, I think they're right in prioritizing those things right there because our goal is to help them achieve that, not interfere with that right there.
Yeah.
Oh.
Does this mean that actually the people that you contact, that the majority of these people are in Title 36 treatment?
A good chunk are.
Then can any of them be court-ordered to your program?
No, because we're a research center, so you have to be voluntary. And actually, I probably wouldn't want it any other way. Yeah.
So, one thing I wonder about is, the prodromal period, oftentimes there's comorbid substance abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And it's very difficult to tell if the symptoms that you're seeing are psychotic organic or psychotic substance abuse.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was wondering if you have any relationship with any of the substance abuse treatment programs for referrals to you. Because I would think that would be another way to kind of get people in the entry that you may not be capturing because of from inpatient units and things like that.
No, and that's actually a really wonderful idea, and that's one, if I think about our referral list of people, we might have one from a substance abuse facility, maybe two up to now. So I think you're right. That's a very fertile ground to tap into here. And just in general, thinking about how we handle referrals here, you have to forgive me for sort of expanding on your question. So substance abuse is typically the norm, as I showed in our slide, for people who come in the door. And what we tried to do is take everyone and say, well, we'll figure out if this is substance-induced or not. And if it's not, well, I have great news to tell you, and then you never have to see me again. But if it isn't substance-induced, I'd rather have provided the care for you from the beginning and not have you wait and maybe miss out on critical opportunities for intervention at that point here. So maybe just general message here for anyone who's a potential referrer to our program. Don't worry about substance abuse. Send them to us, and we'll figure it out over time.
Yes, if a client declines, but the family really wants to participate, what component do you have in place for that? Or can that still happen?
Yeah, we've had that happen before, and they typically come into our family group, and they participate in that. We don't require for our family group that the individual with psychosis come as well. We encourage it because it tends to work better, but don't require it. So we have a number of families there who come by themselves, some of which their loved one isn't even participating in the program at all. So it's still available for them if they wanted to do that.
Do you get any clients from the university student population?
No. And it's been one of my most frustrating experiences here. Was I will say that our attempts to connect with them have not been. It's not even that they haven't been responded to well; they haven't been responded to, is what I'd say on that.
But you do have some students in the program.
We do have students, but none of which have been referred through the university. They come to us from private practitioners, or we had a couple people who Google us. That's also been we have a really bad web page, but it is a web page, and people can find us that way too. Yeah.
With respect to that, I mean, I've worked over there, and I think that part of the problem is that it's kind of its own little world, and so there isn't a lot of recognition for outside providers unless it's referral for ADHD meds. So that's one I think, I agree with you. The entry point is the difficult point. It's getting in and getting FaceTime with somebody. Because I guarantee if you get FaceTime, you'll get the referrals, but it's getting the FaceTime that is a horrible challenge.
Yeah, and I would also add to that I don't think my experience with the U of A campus services is no different than it was at Yale. Although at Yale, what they told me was no undergraduate at Yale has psychosis. So at least now I've been able to escape some of the pompousness that came from being rebuffed there. Well, thank you very much for coming.